I will tape it, ¿no? Lo voy a grabar y después
Okay.
lo voy a subir.
See.
¿Sí? Okay. Robert, let me 1 minute so I can introduce you. Um, to- bueno, hoy tenemos a Robert Vincent, ¿sí? Está en el Instituto Filosofía da Nova de la Universidad, la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales y Humanas de la Universidad Nova de Lisboa. Doctor en filosofía, su trayecto es muy importante, comienza en la Universidad de Glasgow, en Escocia, luego sigue su trabajo en la Georgia State University en Atlanta, pasó por Argentina en el 2017, ahí fue que lo contacté, y en estos momentos se encuentra, como decíamos, en la Universidad Nova de Lisboa, Portugal, donde continúa sus trabajos sobre las implicaciones de la filosofía de Wittgenstein para las ciencias sociales. De ahí surgió un libro recientemente publicado y que él nos va a contar algo también, que se llama Wittgenstein and the Social Sciences, Action, Ideology and Justice. Un gran título y un great book. No lo he leído todavía, pero he leído otras cosas. En este momento participa en un proyecto sobre epistemología de la creencia religiosa que se llama Wittgenstein, Grammar and, claro, es epistemología de la creencia religiosa, Wittgenstein, la gramática y el mundo contemporáneo. Y esta exposición se da en ese marco, ¿sí? Tiene, por supuesto, además tiene muy buenos artículos sobre la articulación entre marxismo y filosofía wittgensteiniana, y bueno, sobre todas las cosas tiene la muy buena onda, la muy buena predisposición de estar aquí, de charlar con nosotros, lo cual le agradecemos muchísimo. Su charla va a ser sobre Wittgenstein, Marx y el nuevo ateísmo, ¿sí? Okay, thanks, Robert. The idea of this meeting, is a presentation of your work and your argument along, let's say, an hour. So later we can have an hour discussion. Well, okay, but this proposal is just a scheme. See, you can manage the meeting as you like. Okay, and it's a great pleasure for us to have you with us. Huh? Thank you, Robert, y gracias a todos. You may start.
Hola todos, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm sorry, my Spanish is not very good, so I'm going to speak in English, but I've put some Spanish on the slides, so that might help with understanding. Right, so according to the Pew Research Center, 84% of the world's population has a religious affiliation. More than half of the people on Earth identify as either Christian or Muslim. A further 1.1 billion are Hindus and 500 million are Buddhists. Religion obviously plays a significant role in many of the issues affecting us around the world today. And we can see this, for example, in the fact that governments throughout much of the world have been promoting Islamophobia to sell war, to divide people and to scapegoat Muslims for problems. When Donald Trump was campaigning to be president of the United States, he called for a complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. And then soon after becoming president, he instituted what's known as the Muslim ban on immigrants coming to the US from Iraq, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said that fear of Islam is a natural reaction and compared Muslim women to letterboxes. His party, the Conservatives, have allied themselves with the anti-Semitic and Islamophobic far right across Europe. Successive governments in France have promoted policies which encroach on the freedom of Muslims to practice their religion in public. The Islamic headscarf was banned in schools in 2004. In 2010, a ban on Islamic veils was introduced. In the summer of 2016, police began arresting Muslim women for wearing the burkini. And in 2018, religious symbols were banned from France's National Assembly. Islamophobia is not just a feature of European and North American politics. India is led by a Hindu nationalist, Narendra Modi, who played a prominent role in the massacre and rape of thousands of Muslims in Gujarat in 2002. He recently introduced legislation targeting Muslims, a Citizenship Amendment Act that allows non-Muslims from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan to come to India, and a National Register of Citizens, which is intended to check the paperwork of people living in India. The two pieces of legislation are connected because the Citizenship Amendment Act means that non-Muslims without paperwork will not face internment or deportation, whereas Muslims will. The law threatens to make many Muslims in India stateless. In China, Uyghur Muslims are under attack from the Chinese government. They're banned from naming children Muhammad, blocked from entering mosques, forbidden from fasting during Ramadan, and hundreds of thousands, perhaps as many as 3 million, have been imprisoned in re-education camps where they're detained against their will and forcibly brainwashed. Islamophobia has been around for a long time, but it grew particularly in recent years in the context of a series of attacks by Western nations on Muslim majority nations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria. It was in that context that the group of atheists known as the New Atheists came to prominence: Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, and Christopher Hitchens. This group has promoted the Islamophobia being used by governments to scapegoat minorities and build support for war. So, for example, Sam Harris has claimed that the people who speak most sensibly about the threat that Islam poses are actually fascists. In the same article, he claimed that solidarity amongst Muslims may be the greatest problem facing civilization. Dawkins is well known for his angry tweeting in opposition to Islam. Over the past couple of decades, Dawkins has tweeted support for far-right figures such as Geert Wilders, Douglas Murray, and Pat Condell. In other tweets, he's claimed that Islam is the greatest force for evil today, compared Islam to Nazism and to cancer, and he has contrasted the aggressive sounding Allahu Akbar with the lovely bells of Winchester Cathedral. Daniel Dennett, somewhat more restrained, but has nonetheless made clumsy, inaccurate assertions about Islam in his book Breaking the Spell, and has conflated opposition to Islamophobia with letting Islamic extremists off the hook. Hitchens has regularly made Islamophobic remarks. Well, he's dead now, but he did regularly make Islamophobic remarks, and claimed that the opponents of Islamophobia were opening the gates for the barbarians. So it's clear that religion is very much implicated in our lives, and it's important to gain a serious understanding of religious belief. Marx and his collaborator Engels and Wittgenstein have contributed in different ways to developing a rich appreciation of religious belief, which contrasts sharply with the kind of atheistic analysis offered by the New Atheists. There are tensions between the accounts of Marx, Engels, and Wittgenstein, which I'll explore in the next little while. But there are also profound insights from these three thinkers that can be united to produce the kind of understanding that's crucial for us to have today. At the end of this paper, I hope to show that the tensions between the views of Marx, Engels, and Wittgenstein are not so extreme as they may initially seem, and also hope to show what it is that Marx and Wittgenstein had, which the New Atheists lack, and which has led the New Atheists to make bigoted attacks on oppressed minorities. So one aspect of the Marxist account of religion that they share with the New Atheists is that they endorse Enlightenment arguments against religion. For example, Marx and Engels accepted Enlightenment criticisms of the Bible as being brutal and morally depraved, and criticized Christianity for encouraging ignorance. Enlightenment thinkers such as Voltaire also challenged defenses of religious belief against problems such as the problem of evil. Engels recommended that the works of Enlightenment thinkers should be translated and distributed amongst workers as a way of combating religious influence upon them. According to Engels' account of religion, it's in direct conflict with science. in such a way that the space for religion gradually shrinks as scientific knowledge grows. Scientific knowledge would eventually leave no space at all for religion. So in the Dialectics of Nature, Engels says that in the history of modern natural science, God is treated by his defenders as Frederick William III was treated by his generals and officials in the Jena campaign. One division of the army after another lays down its arms. One fortress after another capitulates before the march of science, until at last the whole infinite realm of nature is conquered by science and there's no place left in it for a creator. On Engels' account, religion and science compete in giving an account of the universe, and as science advances, religion is beaten back. So besides the deists and atheists associated with the French Enlightenment, Marx and Engels were also strongly influenced by the young Hegelians, thinkers like David Strauss, Bruno Bauer, and Ludwig Feuerbach. Strauss and Bauer pointed to inconsistencies in the Bible and examined its historical accuracy, finding it wanting. Feuerbach argued that God was a creation of human beings, a projection of the finest qualities in human beings into an illusory God. According to Feuerbach, human beings lose contact with themselves through this projection, not recognizing God's features as a projection of their own features. As we augment the concept of God, we diminish ourselves. We can see one of the inspirations for Marx's account of alienation here. Engels, Marx's collaborator, said of Feuerbach's Essence of Christianity that one must himself have experienced the liberating effect of this book to get an idea of it. Enthusiasm was general. We all became at once Feuerbachians. How enthusiastically Marx greeted the new conception, and how much, in spite of all critical reservations, he was influenced by it, one may read in The Holy Family. And Marx himself often used formulations resembling the Feuerbachian inversion. In his introduction to the contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, Marx says that man who looked for a Superman in the fantastic reality of heaven and found nothing there but a reflection of himself will no longer be disposed to find the semblance of himself where he seeks and must seek his true reality. The basis of irreligious criticism is man makes religion, religion does not make man. And he describes religion as reversed world consciousness. In the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, he echoes Feuerbach's reflections on the alienation involved in Christianity, saying that the more that man puts into God, the less he retains in himself. Engels and Marx appear to have thought that the Enlightenment and post-Hegelian criticism of religion had decisively undermined it. In 1844, Marx declared that for Germany, the criticism of religion is in the main complete, and criticism of religion is the premise of all criticism. The account of Marx and Engels, the account of their thought given thus far, suggests that there's little difference between their position and that of the new atheists. Richard Dawkins clearly shares Engels' views about religion and science being in conflict, and also shares his admiration of Enlightenment thinkers. Dawkins cites Marx approvingly in his book, The God Delusion. He refers to studies demonstrating that religiosity correlates with societal problems like income inequality and infant mortality. And he says that Marx's recognition of this aspect of the God temptation is tinged with sympathy for its victims. And in this, if in nothing else, I join him. However, where Dawkins largely focuses his energy on making arguments along the lines of Enlightenment thinkers, Marx and Engels were eager to go beyond them and to correct their errors. Oh, hang on, yeah. So before I come back to looking at a slightly more kind of subtle look at Marx's view on religion, I'll take a look at Wittgenstein's view and show how that contrasts with Marx and Engels's view. So in contrast to both Marx and Engels and the New Atheists, Wittgenstein thinks that religious belief differs from scientific belief in certain significant ways. In his lectures on religious belief delivered at the end of the 1930s, Wittgenstein pointed out that in religious discourse, we use such expressions as, I believe that so-and-so will happen, and use them differently to the way that we use them in science. Of course, Marx and Engels may well agree that religious and scientific discourse are different to each other. Where Wittgenstein disagrees with Marx and Engels is in thinking that certain religious propositions have a logical role. And given this logical role, they can't contradict the kind of empirical conclusions that scientists come to. So what is this peculiar logical role? We can start to get an appreciation of what Wittgenstein was getting at by looking at one of the examples that he used, belief in a last judgment. The different roles played by religious beliefs and ordinary empirical beliefs are brought out by Wittgenstein when he compares belief in a last judgment to belief that a German airplane is overhead. Suppose that someone were a believer and said, I believe in a last judgment. And I said, well, I'm not so sure, possibly. You would say that there was an enormous gulf between us. If he said, there's a German airplane overhead, and I said, possibly I'm not so sure, you'd say we were fairly near. So Wittgenstein suggests that belief in a last judgment might guide someone in their life. In coming to understand the role of their belief, we should not simply rely on what they say, but look at what they do and the way that they behave in other respects. They might say that they have proof that a last judgment will happen, but other aspects of their behavior might indicate that they don't treat their belief in a last judgment as being something that might be proved. It could be that they treat their belief in a last judgment as an unshakable belief. That is, it will show not by reasoning or by appeal to ordinary grounds for belief, but rather by regulating for all in his life. So this belief plays, or at least can play, a regulatory role. It's a rule that guides someone in how they lead their life. Moreover, it's unshakable. That is, it's resistant to apparently contrary evidence. If someone were to believe in a last judgment on the basis of evidence, then that belief would not be a religious one. As Wittgenstein says, the point is that if there were evidence, this would in fact destroy the whole business. In the case of empirical belief, we talk about the probability of something being the case, about hypotheses, and about knowing that something is the case on the basis of evidence. We have opinions about empirical matters. But as Wittgenstein points out, it would sound strange to say that somebody's of the opinion that there will be a last judgment. In the case of religious belief, we talk about dogma and about faith. These differences reflect the different roles played in our lives by scientific practices and religious ones. We play different language games when we worship, pray, and express our religious beliefs to the ones we play when we conduct scientific experiments and report on our empirical observations. So it's clear how this Wittgensteinian picture conflicts with the Marxist one outlined previously. If Wittgenstein is right, then at least some of the claims made in the name of religion will be claims that do not play the role of ordinary empirical propositions, and instead play a logical role that places them beyond rational doubt and beyond assessment in terms of evidence. They play a logical role, which means that they're shunted away into a siding and placed out of the traffic of evidence, justification, and doubt. This means that they can't come into conflict with scientific evidence, and the progress of science can't undermine them in any direct way, although scientific changes might persuade people to take up other commitments. People might be converted. So it seems clear that there's a difference between the Marxist view, which sees religion as capitulating before the march of science, and the Wittgensteinian account, which doesn't think of scientific evidence as contradicting religious belief. So I'm going to now talk about Marx and Wittgenstein's views again, but I'm going to describe them in a slightly more subtle way to bring out commonalities between them and show that there's not such a stark difference between them as perhaps it seems. So, although Marx and Engels accepted Enlightenment criticisms of religion, they didn't repeat the arguments of the Enlightenment in their own work, but rather they wanted to explicate the various roles that religion plays in our lives. They recognized that many people held on to their religious belief despite the fact that religion had received justified criticism. Marx and Engels sought to give an account of why that was. They moved away from making abstract arguments about religious phenomena and instead focused on examining religious phenomena in their historical, economic, political, and social contexts. In the background to their examination of religion was an account of history as a series of class struggles, and the role of practice was also significant. Marx wanted to move away from armchair speculation towards a transformative philosophy that combined theory, interpretation, and practice. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Marx and Engels criticised the young Hegelians for failing to see their task through to the end. Taking a dialectical approach from Hegelians, where thesis and antithesis are superseded by a synthesis, Marx and Engels did not merely want to negate religion, but to preserve what's good in it and raise it to a higher level. Roland Bohr, in elaborating Marx and Engels' account, notes that socialism does not kick away the ladder of religion, but pulls it up and uses the wood to construct something quite new. Marx agreed with Ludwig Feuerbach's inversion, man makes religion, religion does not make man, but he wanted to go beyond it. If we accept that people make the kind of projections that Feuerbach suggested and alienate themselves in the process, if we accept that people invest hope in a world beyond this one, then we need to explain why it is that people make such projections. If Feuerbach's account is true, then it's a sign that something has gone wrong in the life of human beings. And it's urgent to understand the conditions that give rise to people investing hope in another world and in a being of their own creation. Marx said that the task of philosophy, once the saintly form of human self-alienation had been unmasked, what Feuerbach did, is to unmask self-alienation in its unholy forms. We live in a world in which the process of creating things in workplaces is often out of our control, where the products of our labour are alienated from us, where we work for the sake of the profit of others. Billions live in dire poverty, and huge numbers die of curable diseases. In these circumstances, a turn towards religion is a search for comfort and an expression of alienation. Thinking about it in terms of class, it's also convenient for employers that people's dissatisfaction should be channeled into a world beyond this one, instead of being focused on fighting the exploitation that they generate. As Marx said, religious distress is at the same time the expression of real distress and the protest against real distress. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, just as it is a spirit of a spiritless situation. It's the opium of the people. So Marx wanted to move beyond the young Hegelians by striving to understand the ways in which people were alienated, exploited, and debased. But he also wanted to move beyond their analysis in another way, by emphasizing the role of practice. Once we understand the relationships of exploitation and alienation that accompany capitalist relations, we should strive to alter those circumstances to get rid of the exploitation and the alienation. We need to come to an understanding of why it is that people are inclined towards religious ideas, but also need to think hard about how to change those circumstances, as well as act to change them. The criticism of religion ends with the categoric imperative to overthrow all relations in which man is debased, enslaved, abandoned, despicable essence. The way to move beyond religion to a higher unity is not, as the new atheists seem to think, to repeat the arguments of the Enlightenment without much regard to exploitation, alienation, and discrimination, but instead to revolutionize the conditions which produce religion. Once the earthly family is discovered to be the secret of the Holy Family, the former must then itself be destroyed in theory and practice. The Marxist approach to religion is then quite different to the approach of rationalists like the new atheists. Marx thought that what we need to do is to address the distress that people experience, understand their hopes, their needs and desires, and to fight for a world in which their lives are made better. Religion is understood as a comfort, an expression of alienation, and also as an ideological tool of oppression, used to divert expressions of distress away from the people responsible for it. Given this understanding, the criticism of religion is to be subordinated to the task of winning the class struggle and creating a better world. To fight for a better world means standing alongside oppressed groups like Muslims when they're coming under attack, because assaults on Muslims from politicians and the media are meant to divide working people and to prevent them from overcoming exploitative relations. To overcome oppression, both religious and non-religious workers need to stand in solidarity with one another against a common enemy. Although communists have something of a reputation for being firmly in the atheist camp, the most prominent figures in philosophizing from a Marxist perspective about religion have taken up Marx's attitude. Lenin, for example, said that if a strike has been called, it's the duty of a Marxist to place the success of the strike movement above everything else, vigorously to counteract the division of workers in this struggle into atheists and Christians, vigorously to oppose any such division. Lenin said that we must not only admit workers who preserve their belief in God into the Social Democratic Party, we must deliberately set out to recruit them. And in 1979, Christians joined a left-wing insurrection to overthrow the Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua. The Sandinista Front, in its declaration on religion, said that Christians have been an integral part of our revolutionary history to a degree unprecedented in any other revolutionary moment of Latin America. Our experience has shown that it's possible to be a believer and a committed revolutionary at the same time. So, like Marx and Engels, Wittgenstein is eager to think about religion in terms of practices that are embedded in our lives and that don't simply involve religious aspects. Wittgenstein's account of religion in his later philosophy is of a piece with other aspects of his philosophy, in that it emphasizes the diversity of practices and the variety of uses of language within religion. When O.K. Bousma asked Wittgenstein what he had to say about religious truth, he's said to have responded by saying that there's no sense in talking about religious truth in general, and to have emphasized that religion takes many forms, there are similarities, there's nothing in common among all religions. It's fairly clear that Wittgenstein did not think that every sentence uttered by a religious person in the course of their religious life was the expression of an irrational commitment of the kind we've been discussing, the kind of rule-like and unshakable statements like belief in a last judgment. In the remarks published as Culture and Value, Wittgenstein describes the Christian faith as refuge in this ultimate distress, as being for someone who feels himself lost and who needs infinite help. This doesn't sound too distant from Marx's talk of alienation and of religion being the expression of real distress the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world. In his remarks on Fraser's Golden Bough, Wittgenstein emphasises the common features of religious life and the lives of non-religious people. Both groups engage in ritualistic practices. And Wittgenstein wants to say that there's something right about the claim that man is a ceremonial animal. Throughout the world, people engage in ritualistic practices involving both instinctive and symbolic aspects. Fraser's account of magic treated it as if it was a primitive science, with primitive people, for example, performing rain ceremonies, thinking that they'd bring about rainfall, or stabbing pitchers, thinking that they would thereby kill their enemy. According to Fraser's account, what these people are doing are forming hypotheses about what their actions will bring about, and then acting to bring it about, but their science is inferior to the science practiced in England. What Fraser fails to consider, Wittgenstein points out, is that these ritualistic actions might not be instrumental at all. They might not be intended as a means to bring about some end. Wittgenstein invites us to consider the similarity between the rituals of primitive people and familiar occurrences such as kissing the picture of a loved one and venting frustration by beating the ground. In these cases, we do not believe that in kissing the picture we thereby kiss the loved one, or that by beating the ground we help to correct the situation that's frustrating us. Our actions are not a means to an end, and nor are they based on any kind of primitive theory. If we follow in Wittgenstein's footsteps, we should heed his anti-theoretical remarks and look and see what roles utterances from religious believers are playing. Religious remarks might be expressions of emotions or of beliefs. They might be irrational commitments, or they might be closer to ordinary beliefs. Religious people, just like everybody else, might get tied up in conceptual confusions and utter nonsense on occasion. We need to look carefully at what people say and take careful note of the context in order to appreciate whether somebody's uttering nonsense, expressing their emotions, or asserting a fundamental commitment of theirs. We can't determine in advance what form religious utterances or utterances about religion might take. Wittgenstein himself comments that the mere fact that someone says that they believe on evidence doesn't tell me enough for me to be able to say now whether I can say of a sentence, God exists, that your evidence is unsatisfactory or insufficient, suggesting that we need to look beyond the sentence itself, as well as at what people say about their utterances, at the role that such sentences play in the life of the person and a wider context. What this shows is that Wittgenstein is not committed to the view that all religious utterances are beyond rational evaluation. It's clearly possible that people might speak nonsense in the course of their religious life. We can also criticise religious believers, taking our lead from Wittgenstein, for presenting a scientific account of their beliefs. A religious believer might treat their own beliefs as being open to proof by referring to evidence. Wittgenstein, in his lectures, criticised Father O'Hara for being one of those people who make it a question of science. And he said that he would definitely call O'Hara unreasonable. If this is religious belief, then it's all superstition. Wittgenstein also imagines a case of going to Lourdes with a credulous friend and them claiming that they had proof of the divine in that they'd seen blood coming out of something there, something like a statue or something. Wittgenstein's imagined response to this is not to say this is a religious belief and so it's beyond evaluation, but rather to say I'd tried to convince him that he'd seen nothing of any consequence. We should also remember that religion is not detached from other regions of life. It's not entirely self-contained. As the Wittgensteinian philosopher of religion, D.C. Phillips, has pointed out, we might criticize religious believers on the basis of what we already know about things like suffering and death. Some religious believers might try to explain away the reality of suffering or try to say that all suffering has some point. When they speak like this, one may accuse them of not taking suffering seriously. So I'll conclude here by noting some of the commonalities between Marx and Engels and Wittgenstein. Both Marx and Wittgenstein think that it's significant that calling someone's attention to an error is not enough to turn them away from their way of behaving. Both present accounts of religion that are not wholly rationalistic. Marx did not think that religious ways of life would fall away in the face of rational criticism, and Wittgenstein presents us with an account of religion that brings our attention to irrational commitments and which foregrounds the role of passions. Both Marx and Wittgenstein emphasize the fact that religious practices are peculiarly human. Both stress the role of practice. Neither can be accused of simply looking at beliefs in the abstract. Both are eager to situate religion within a wider context of lives involving all kinds of other aspects. And as a result, they want to emphasize that religious believers and non-religious believers have much in common. Both have a keen sense of how beliefs might change over time and shift with circumstances. In the remarks collected as the remarks on the foundations of mathematics, Wittgenstein comments that the sickness of a time is cured by an alteration in the mode of life of human beings, and it was possible for the sickness of philosophical problems to get cured only through a changed mode of thought and of life, not through a medicine invented by an individual. Presumably, Wittgenstein would have been open to the Marxist idea that religion might wither away in certain circumstances. Now, in remarking on these common features, I'm clearly papering over some marked differences between the two. The commonalities that I've remarked upon are broad and vague enough that they can incorporate quite different accounts. However, these commonalities are sufficient to distinguish views like those of Wittgenstein and Marx from more rationalistic philosophers, such as those who've been recently presenting critiques of religion under the banner of New Atheism. Both Wittgenstein and Marx provide us with resources to criticize the kind of abstract anti-religious argument which largely ignores the oppression faced by religious believers and gives insufficient attention to the wider context in which religious believers live their lives. As strange as it sounds, the picture presented of religion by the New Atheists is too rationalistic in at least two ways. This sounds strange because it seems as though rationality, being a good thing, is not something that you can have too much of. The point is not that they're too rational, but that they extend reason, evidence, and argument into domains where they don't belong or where they're not of much use. One way in which Dawkins and other New Atheists are overly rationalistic is that they take for granted that any claim that someone makes can be backed up by evidence, and that the claim made is more or less probable. Dawkins talks about belief in God as a hypothesis, but that ignores a fairly significant tradition within theology and philosophy, and among religious believers who are neither theologians nor philosophers, of thinking of religious beliefs as being a matter of faith. Dawkins seems to think of faith as illegitimate just by definition, that it's firm belief without evidence or without sufficient evidence, so that you have to make a leap. There's something like the Lockean picture in the background, where beliefs are appropriately held in proportion to the evidence supporting them. But there are lots of everyday beliefs that we have and things that we know without any kind of evidence to back them up. So, for example, I know that I had a dream in which my brother came to Lisbon last night. I don't have any evidence for that, and nor do I need to present evidence to legitimately make a claim about what I dreamed about. Perceptual beliefs are another kind of belief that have been taken to be basic. J.L. Austin illustrates how perception, knowledge, and evidence are related when he gives the example of approaching a pig pen. So Austin says, it's not the case that whenever a material object statement is made, the speaker must have or could produce evidence for it. This may sound plausible enough, but it involves a gross misuse of the notion of evidence. The situation in which I would properly be said to have evidence for the statement that some animal is a pig is that, for example, in which the beast itself is not actually on view, but I can see plenty of pig-like marks on the ground outside its retreat. If I find a few buckets of pig food, that's a bit more evidence. And the noises and the smell may provide better evidence still. But if the animal then emerges and stands there plainly in view, it's no longer any question of collecting evidence. Its coming into view does not provide me with more evidence that it's a pig. I can now just see that it is. The question is settled. So it's common for us to have knowledge of things that we've perceived without our claims being based on evidence. Another kind of claim that Dawkins ignores is the kind discussed previously in discussing Wittgenstein's understanding of religion. We might have irrational commitments that are rule-like. These need not be religious. In Uncertainty, Wittgenstein gives examples like, the earth existed long before my birth. So there's a great variety of things that we might be said to believe or to know or to be certain of that do not involve support by evidence or justification or argument at all. In our everyday lives, we come to know things by perceiving that they are so, without relying upon evidence at all. And our knowledge is no less legitimate for it. Dawkins just ignores all of this, takes God's exist to be an ordinary existential statement that requires evidential support, and then blames religious believers for not coming up with good evidence. So that's one way in which he's overly rationalistic. He seems to think that whatever claims people make can be supported by evidence and should be supported by evidence. Whether people are engaging in religious practices or scientific experiment, what they're doing is describing the world around them, and those descriptions are supported by evidence or argument on Dawkins' view. So the second way in which Dawkins is overly rationalistic is that he's very abstract in his argument. Despite recognizing that there are correlations between things like poverty and inequality and religiosity, he basically conducts most of his arguments as if he's confronted with timeless arguments for the existence of God and ignores people's material circumstances. But that leads him and other new atheists into the bigoted behavior mentioned at the beginning of this chapter. Their failure to recognize, for example, Muslims are an oppressed group around much of the world leads him into attacks on Muslims that amount to Islamophobia, as well as leading him down the path of associating with far-right figures, because he sees winning an abstract argument about religion as more important than overcoming oppression. Marxist observations about power, oppression, class struggle, attending to circumstances would help to avoid this tendency towards abstraction. Winning people over might involve offering them solidarity in the face of oppression, rather than trying to beat them in an argument over cosmology. Dawkins is overly rationalistic in that sense too, that he doesn't give sufficient attention to the possibility of making the world better and making our lives richer by means other than rational arguments. The thinkers examined in this paper, Marx, Engels, and Ludwig Wittgenstein, offer alternative accounts of religion to the new atheists, which correct for their problems. Wittgenstein's account of language and of religion shows us that the claims that people make don't have to be backed by evidence in order for them to be deemed reasonable or rational. In some cases, evidence is entirely irrelevant, and this is a possibility that the new atheists don't entertain. The arguments of Marx and Engels show that it's important to be attentive to the shifting circumstances that people live their lives in, and to give serious weight to considerations like power and oppression. This corrects for the tendency of the new atheists towards abstract argument. By combining insights from these thinkers, we arrive at a richer, more compassionate understanding of religion, and thereby put ourselves in a better position to make the world a better place. The abstract rationalistic account of the new atheists leaves them open to the influence of intolerant views, whereas if we keep in mind the insights of Marx, Engels and Wittgenstein, we're more likely to promote empathy and harmony. And one final comment, you don't have to be a Marxist or a Wittgensteinian, I don't think, to appreciate these points. So there's also liberal thinkers like Tim Crane, who make a lot of these points. I think when I described the commonalities between Marx and Wittgenstein, I think there's a whole host of thinkers that could be included as having those kind of thoughts in common with Marx and Wittgenstein. So there are liberals who think along the lines of Marx and Wittgenstein, and there's also the liberals of the new atheists. They describe themselves as liberals. I think quite often they're pretty far over to the right, but they're liberals of a sort. They're kind of crude followers of the Enlightenment tradition, I think. So I'll finish there. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Robert. We now can make some questions on Vincent's work. Okay, his neighbor, Florian, you wanted to ask something.
Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you, Rob, for this very elaborated talk and for laying out the arguments so nicely and so professionally. I think that was very clear. And although I'm not a Marxist, I think I can follow your arguments very well. I have a question, or I have two questions, quick questions before I have to leave, unfortunately. So the first question is regarding the communalities between Wittgenstein and Marx. So you brought this rather famous quotation from Marx that religion is opium for the people. And it sounded for me that there is the idea behind this phrase is nevertheless a means and relation. You pointed out the practical background or the practical basis on which the phrase is meant, right? But I mean, like, so if you say religion is opium for the people, then religion is the means for any end that you might have in mind there, right? But then on the other hand, you showed Fraser's critique to Wittgenstein, Wittgenstein's critique to Fraser, I'm sorry, saying, well, Fraser, you don't have to see or understand ritus as something that is a means to an end, but as an end in itself. So my question would be, isn't there, with all the communalities that there are, isn't there nevertheless a difference between Marx and Engels and Wittgenstein in seeing the practical issue from different angles, namely Marx, Engels from an instrumental, nevertheless instrumental angle, and Wittgenstein saying, well, it's rather an end in itself.
Yeah, so I do agree with you. Yeah, I think Wittgenstein would have thought that Marx's take on religion was scientistic in the kind of ways that I've talked about in the talk, right? So I don't think he's kind of Marx and Engels are rationalistic quite in the way that the new atheists are. They're not quite as crude as that, but I think they would get that Wittgenstein would criticize them for the kind of reasons that you're talking about. One of the interesting things about the opium quote, though, so I think you could give it quite a lot of different sort of instrumental construals, right? So I talked about several different roles that they think that religion plays in people's lives. One thing to keep in mind with that quote is the 19th century context, where opium was used as a medicine, that it's not the sort of heroin users sitting around on a on a doorstep that Marx probably had in mind. He himself used opium regularly. So the connotations of it are probably slightly different to the connotations that people might give it these days.
Okay, but nevertheless, it's a practical context in which the use of opium or the use of drugs is thought in instrumentally and not, as Wittgenstein argues against Fraser, as a practice with an end in itself. That
right. Yes. Yeah. I agree. There is that. I agree. There is that context. Although I think as well that Marx and Engels gave a much. So obviously, I'm only giving a kind of snapshot of both, and I think it's sort of fairly clear that there's the Marxist position doesn't just boil down to that there's sort of space to recognise that there might be practices. So I mean, I consider myself a Marxist, and I take quite a lot of what Wittgenstein says on board. So I don't think a Marxist sort of has to be sort of crudely instrumentalist in their take on religion. But I think Marx and Engels could be quite crude, especially Engels, I think, did give a fairly kind of crude, deterministic account of superstructure and an instrumentalistic kind of account and scientific account of a lot of things. Yeah. Thanks for your question.
Yeah. If there is no other question, I have a second one, but
I think it's related. Just about I liked your work, your argument, but I think I can't see very clearly the position of the task of the intellectual that you propose, because I think that you point that the new atheists they just criticize religion or Muslim, and they but that way they promote Islamophobia, etc. Although there is although they are abstract, I think that when you talk about religion and you say, what do you do in your work? You are making something like pointing out that they are just pointing out the cultural beliefs, and that they, I don't know, that Dawkins, etc., are taking the beliefs, the faith beliefs, like epistemic beliefs. So what is your, Robert Vinton, task for philosophy and for, porque I think that you say, if you just criticize what they think, the religious thought, you don't see the roots, the social roots of those beliefs and the oppression and everything that they, and all the situation that they live. That is what is need to be changed, right? So what can we as philosophers do? Because we have to make some rational points with other philosophers, just like you are doing with the new atheists. So I don't know. I'm not an activist. So, but I think that there's a point there. I would like you to explain, to clarify, what's the task of philosophy for you in this particular work. See, I like your work because you, for example, take Sandinists, and here in Argentina, in South America, we have a lot of people who made some approaches between Christianity, for example, and Marxism. There's a lot. See. But I don't know if they are, at the end they don't finish in some faith article, see, movement, not a Marxist movement. So that's my, my contradiction. I don't, well, there's no solution, but I would like to ask for that. What's the task of philosophers, you, in this case, for example?
Okay, so I think that you should kind of combine the insights of the three of them, the Marx and the Engels and Wittgenstein. So, for example, I think one of the ways of doing philosophy is the kind of Wittgensteinian way of describing the grammar of our language and describing the practices that people engage in, and coming to appreciate the different roles, the different kinds of things that religious people say and do play in their lives. So I think that's one thing you can do, and it's not a particularly Marxist thing to do, right? So there's the kind of conceptual side of things. On the other hand, I mean, I think in terms of Islamophobia, I think it's important to actually do things, right? And I mean, it's not specifically something for philosophers to do, but I think philosophers, as much as anybody else, should do things like have arguments with people where they point out the flaws in these arguments against Muslims. So I mean, it's just insane to claim that Islam is the greatest evil in the world today. I mean, you know, there's other far bigger evils around. American imperialism, I think. The number of people that have been killed in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan, tens of millions of people have been forced out of their homes. Muslims haven't done anything like that, you know. And to recognize speak to people about the oppression that Muslims face. I mean, Muslims are facing incredible oppression in China and India, the United States, the UK, France, Germany, lots of places around the world. I don't know how it is in Argentina, whether it's something that's been used there or.
Yeah.
Bolsonaro certainly has in Brazil.
Okay, but I think that take this example. The Holy Family. I think that if you are Marxist, you say, if you are Feuerbach, you say that's the Holy Family. This is the earthly family. You have to cut the Holy Family. It's no good. Okay. Now you have Engels and Marx that say the Holy Family is like an idealization of the conditions that aren't good in the earth. So this tension is a good thing. So we have to, let's say, make the Holy Family in the earth. So I don't know. But you have Wittgenstein that says the Holy Family and the earthly family are different things. They're different things. A holy
Right.
is like a regulator of your life, like a belief that gives meaning to some actions of yours. And the earthly family is, I don't know, is this one. Okay, so that's my point. What which of these models do you have in order to say philosophy must be, I don't know, this one? There are three options. I think those three options. I think that new atheists are like Feuerbach. I don't know. That they just want to cut off the Holy Family,
The Holy Family.
the Holy Allah. And I understand that there's two models, but I don't know if the other two models are too compatible. Too compatible.
Right. Yeah.
That was.
Yeah, if I'm completely honest, I struggle to know what to think. I struggle to know whether to describe myself as an atheist, given that I find quite a lot of what Wittgenstein says convincing. On the other hand, there's a big part of me that's tempted to think along sort of Marxist lines and think, you know, that it really would be better for people to be free of religious views, that it's a kind of distraction,
Yeah.
that you could do better things with your life than to you know, live it in accordance with Christian beliefs. So part of me is tempted to say, so I mean, I'm presenting it as if there's a single kind of Wittgensteinian take on things, but there are. So I think you mentioned in email discussions with me Kai Nielsen. So so Kai Nielsen says that what Wittgenstein should have done to be consistent, given that Wittgenstein was anti-metaphysical, what he should have think, you know, religious beliefs are metaphysical beliefs, and you know, to write them off as nonsense as well. And I mean, I've got some sympathy for that. And you know, there is quite a tradition of people, actually, even amongst people who are sympathetic to religion, of thinking about religious language in terms of nonsense. You know, that when you actually sort of explore notions like God, that you do end up sort of tying yourselves up in all kinds of contradictions. So I'm really genuinely not sure. But so a kind of rule of thumb from a Wittgensteinian angle would be to kind of take this attitude of look and see. And, you know, it's at least possible that a religious claim might be playing the kind of role that Wittgenstein ascribes to it. So it's at least possible, I think, that somebody might have religious hinges, irrational commitments. And you sort of take each case as it comes. So some religious people surely are speaking nonsense. There's quite a lot of religious people who are tied up in kind of scientistic thinking. So you've got people in the States who've got theme parks with dinosaurs and Jesus side by side. And I think you've just got to say, you know, that person just doesn't get what religion's about all the time at all. And they're just, it's just a load of rubbish.
There are the 2 points in the work that I think that you could have made more points for you. One is that they call themselves brights, ¿no? De Dawkins, ellos se dicen a sí mismos brights. O sea, en vez de decir gay, los gay, el gay es...
That's right, yeah, the bright thing, yeah.
Ellos se llaman brights, en vez de decirse ateo para no quedar como que son no algo. Pero es horrible, y es el uso de una palabra que no tiene ninguna función y hay una obvia relación con el iluminismo. Bright is like enlightenment, I don't know, it's a... And the other thing is the plane. I know, I am thinking about September 11th. A plane is a faith matter or a scientific matter. Okay, Osama bin Laden, for the people in the plane, that was a religious fact or a mixed. I don't know. I would have. You could have, or you could play with that. I don't know if it would be a little. Perhaps they will point you that you're using a theme, but I don't know. I think that there is no such a religious proposition or a empirical proposition. There are some propositions that become religious and some that become in this context. There are some contexts in which there is a plane above us would be a religious. For example, if you are like Wittgenstein in the middle of a bomb bombardeo, see? I don't know. Someone else wants to, let's open the, okay, Ivan.
Gracias, Santiago. Thanks, Robert, for the talk. Was quite interesting. My question is, in your conclusion, you talk about like the whole new atheist, but you took only the Dawkins vision. And I read a little bit of Sam Harris and the later books of him, and he talked about, for example, waking up as in a sense of spirituality without religion. I think that he saw his vision as a critique of the institution of religion rather than the whole pack of religion itself.
Mm.
So he started to see um, Oriental religions such as Buddhism or mindfulness as a way to interact with the transcendental order of things without the scientific point of view. And on the other hand, for example, in the moral landscape, he tries to search for a moral realism that the facts is intrinsic, the moral values are intrinsic to the facts. So I think that there is also a few differences between the four horsemen of the new atheism. Dawkins is not the same as, for example, Sam Harris and even Dennett. So I don't know. Maybe I would like to see how do you think as the new atheists, not as a group, but as individual itself in the conclusion.
Yeah, okay. So I suppose, I mean, I brought them all together at the beginning because I was making my theme the Islamophobia thing. And I think that is at least something that they do all have in common. And if I'm honest, I haven't read as much Harris as I have of Dawkins and Dennett. I think Dawkins and Dennett certainly are both pretty scientistic and don't give sufficient attention to things like parent oppression. I don't think Sam Harris can do either, given the way that he talks about Muslims, at least in sort of that respect. You know, he's the most extreme of the lot, I think. You know, the fact that he talks about you know,
at least the times that I listen to him in his podcast, Making Sense, he always is trying to reach to the institutional critique of Muslim and extremist Islamism that she had. But I don't know. I am not a specialist in Harris, but I think that moreover, he has an app for mindfulness and meditation.
Yeah, I've heard of that. Yeah,
waking up. So I don't think that it's quite injustice the critic that you are tackled to him about the religion and the whole proposition of being completely scientific.
Right.
I don't know.
So yeah, so there's one kind of criticism that I didn't make of them and that maybe I should kind of add that would kind of address Santiago Garmendia's point as well. So in terms of something like September the 11th, I think this is something that these new atheists have in common, is that they tend to crudely ascribe these things to religion and ignore the political and sort of economic factors behind it. So Osama bin Laden, when he was giving his rationale for September the 11th, it wasn't all about, you know, what's found in the Quran or something like that. It was a big list of political grievances that he had about getting American troops out of Saudi Arabia, and I can't remember what else was in there, but it was a list of complaints about American imperialism in the Middle East, essentially. And I don't think you can understand why people would be driven to such sort of violence without looking at those kind of factors. You know, what really drives people? You know, people in Iraq are going to be driven by the fact that they've had their house bombed and you know, they've got a brutal dictator torturing people and things like that. They're not going to be thinking about the fine details of disagreements between Sunni and Shiite Muslims or something along those lines, even if the various kind of warring groups might sometimes sort of divide up along those. those lines. And so I think that's a problem that both Harris and all four of them, I think they have that kind of problem of reducing problems to religious problems. But yeah, I do take your point. I haven't given enough attention to differences between them, and I think you're right about that. Yeah, I should read more Sam Harris and maybe sort of think a bit more about addressing points he makes specifically. Yeah.
Thank you, Vincent.
Bueno, gracias, Iván.
Yo no la escucho a Ana, que creo que quiere hablar.
Ana, no se te escucha. No.
¿Ahí se me escucha?
Sí.
Ahí está. Okay. Hi, thank you, Robert, for your talk. I really enjoyed it. Well, I was thinking about a lot of things that you said, and I agree a lot with this takeout. And I was thinking also about what you said to Santiago, that you were not sure about what to think about religion in general, because I think that sometimes we kind of want to have this backup from reason to say that the extremist or the fundamentalist is wrong somehow, like in a rational way. And we kind of wish to have that, I don't know, reason to back us up and say that we are right. And I think that this Wittgenstein is showing that maybe what is interesting is that what you said about it's not like all a religious discourse or all what the religious person can say is beyond criticism or rational justification. We can criticize some things, but I think that, well, the difficulty is to maybe point out when can we do that and when are we just being ethnocentric or just narrowly minded. And I would ask you if you think that this approach, what is showing is also the limits of of justification, but not even in religion. This idea that faith is somehow beyond reason, but also our bounds of sense, like what you said, this idea that we all have our hinges or our beliefs that we don't have evidence for. I trust a lot of things that I don't have evidence for, or I trust the testimony of someone, and that doesn't mean I have evidence about that. So, because I was thinking, I was once talking to a friend that is very religious, and I was saying something like, I don't know, the value of the importance of being able to, I don't know, criticize my own ideas. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, like to look at what you think and why you think that, and to be able to criticize that somehow. And she said, like, no, because faith is belief without doubt or without reason. Like, in faith, you don't need that or it's not desirable to put in doubt what you believe. That is faith. And I found that she was kind of right, that I didn't have an argument to criticize that. Like she was right. If she said, well, this is my faith and I don't want to analyze it somehow, And that in itself wasn't irrational, that idea.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, there's quite a complex of different things in there. So on the one hand, so I certainly wouldn't want to say that you can't criticize, right? And so you agree with that. And you can criticize extremists. You can criticize them from your own perspective. You can criticize them using the kind of moral principles that you apply in other situations. So if somebody blows somebody up, you know, that's wrong, and there's no sort of relativizing. There's no sort of relativizing that. So I don't take Wittgenstein's views to kind of imply relativism. What it does imply, though, is that you might sometimes be kind of banging your head against a wall when you're trying to argue with a religious person, that it might be better to take other means than to try to kind of meet them head on with argument, right? And another conclusion is the conclusion that you just came to there, that they're not necessarily you know, unreasonable or irrational if their perspective is sort of entirely different to yours. It might not be possible to sort of ascribe that to them. Criticism, though, I certainly think you can make. It's just in from case to case, you're going to have to try different things, aren't you? It's the kind of particulars thing. So sometimes, you know, you're going to come across somebody that you can argue directly with, like the guy who owns the theme park with the dinosaurs and Jesus in it. He's just wrong, you know, and you bring the scientific evidence against him. And if he continues to argue with you, then it just shows that his hinges are so sort of utterly different to yours that you're not going to get through to him. It's basically rejecting all of science, right? You know, it's rejecting physics and chemistry. All relies on the earth being very, very old and not being as the Bible says that it is. So in order to kind of take the Bible literally, what you need to do is entirely reject all of science. But I suppose somebody might, you might sort of argue with them, and you might just end up banging your head against the wall. And then it might make sense to use some other means. And certainly, I think with extremists, it makes sense to think very much, not just in terms of trying to win an argument with them. It makes sense to try to think about sort of addressing the problems out of which that extremism arises, you know, start to fix these societies and make sure that people are well fed, that they've got a roof over their head, and that they're not, you know, being bombed and all the rest of it. And then you might find that the world becomes a more peaceful place.
I found very interesting that quote that you mentioned in your work about this idea that people might be converted. Like I can't convince you with an argument, maybe like it is an objective discussion, but maybe I can show you another way to think about this, and I can like convert you.
Right. And I think even though Marx doesn't speak in exactly those terms, I think there's quite a tradition of that in Marxism, right? So I think there's quite a lot of Marxists that I've come across who will sort of put a stress on the idea that you're not just to kind of argue with people, you're to think very practically about showing people how you can make the world a better place, you know. And so you sort of demonstrate to people in practice that your ideas can kind of bring about something that's better.
Ahí quería yo, perhaps, quería about what Anna said, that there is a possibility of by means of the immanent criticism, because you use religion when you like, when you want, and I don't know, as you said, practically no one can live in the Bible way, but probably the Bible is so contradictory that no one can live like that. So there is always a possibility that you have an interpretation about the Last Judgment Day, and if you don't behave like that in your in all the I don't know, the context that you should behave like that, it means that you are not a believer, uh, but we are not always coherent. But I think that you can make a point, Ana, pienso, le podrías discutir diciendo, eh, si vos piensas esto, ¿por qué no te comportas así siempre? Why don't you behave like that? If you, because, porque siempre, because they always take the religious as well as philosophers, we took just what we like, what we want, what we need to justify our,
Santiago,
our context. Sí, perdón. Eso pienso que
you are taking a Harris argument against the jihadists, for example, in a conversation with
Claro,
Jordan
contra-
Peterson. He takes the same argument, the contradictions between the holy books and how the interpretations are really biased.
Sí, pero digo, es la crítica permanente es una posibilidad siempre ahí, aunque nadie creo que there's no, I don't know if conversion, there is a Marxist conversion también, no? I think there's a big thing in conversion también, but bueno, we can. Okay, who else wants to make some question, wants to punch? Mauricio? Okay.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Okay. Good night. Okay. I have a little thing. Okay. I think that there is another element in the new atheist that is particularly annoying is and that you don't mention is their optimism. No, they are like happy world people because they are American world happiness or British world happiness. I think they I don't know which one of them is the most optimist, but I think Dawkins for sure. I don't know who else. But that's another thing, no?
There's what's his name? Steven Pinker wrote a book
Pinker.
where he sort of made that kind of case, didn't he? That
Pinker,
you know things aren't that bad, everything's getting better.
Better than ever. I heard them also. See, Ivan.
I don't know to what extent. I'm pretty sure there is that kind of tendency within the new atheist, the kind of liberal idea of sort of ongoing progress. But I don't know enough about them to know to what extent. I'm sure I have kind of come across that a bit with them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Jordan Peterson too is too optimistic, but he has Jordan Peterson, a psychologist from Canada, that he gathered a lot with Harris and all the intellectual dark web that they say now in America.
Mm-hmm.
They have in common that the new optimism that the Pinker said in his book. I don't know. I haven't read it, so I can't.
And how would you criticize that then, Santiago? What points would you make in opposition to that?
I think that they complement with Islamophobia and the I don't know, the Orientalism and the and all that Asian primitive religious world there, and the optimism of the Western world, and that we can. It's like we have they are the last stones that anchor, no? That don't let us go through the ideal world So I think that that's why they are optimistic, because they have to be. Oh, I think that they complement with the Asian strange barbarian violent world, and here democracy, uh, good word, good knowledge. They don't speak about science and money, and it's like it's I don't know, it's Darwin and everything that comes next. I think that would be the thing that I would put it there to complement as a critique, because it's it's a whole package, Me parece, I think. The last question is, what would be my definition of ideology? Because there's one very popular that is about presenting what's different as the same, and presenting what's the same as different. I mean, your religion does that. We are the same in the church. Yeah, there we are earthly brothers, all equal, but we are here. I don't know, or in a football, um, in a soccer game, I could kill, and the other team, who's like me, but defend, I don't know, a millionaire who is in my team. That's I am more like my religious or national or sport enemy. I'm not his enemy. I am the enemy of those who they present as friends. You know.
Yeah, so ideology, I think, is one of those expressions which is sort of multiply ambiguous, right? So it's sometimes used as a sort of pejorative term, right? It's
Yeah.
used as an expression which indicates that it's something that's not the truth, right? It's ideology. It's some kind of distortion of what's going on. But then I think it's, people also talk about ideologies pretty freely as if sort of the various takes on political life are each ideology. So you could say socialism is an ideology, liberalism is an ideology, conservatism is an ideology. Maybe you could talk about Islamic ideology without any kind of pejorative sense sort of attaching to that, just using it to pick out a particular way of thinking about the world as kind of set of commitments and moral rules. And then it's quite often used in these sort of cultural conversations, the way you're talking about it there in connection with football, right? That there's these sort of, and there I think it sort of quite often goes with the pejorative sense,
Yeah.
where it's where it's used to describe some kind of way of deceiving you that's kind of somehow sort of integrated into the culture. So certainly football, that I'd want to say there is all kinds of sort of ideological stuff attached to football, that it plays all kinds of ideological rules, especially you've got the international competitions as well. There's sort of nations being a sort of political construct.
Maradona. Maradona.
Oh yeah. There's all kinds of political sort of associations with Maradona. True.
Ok, ¿alguna pregunta? Acá. We have another question acá, Sebastián.
Hi, Robert. I really liked your work. So in the first place, thank you. I want to ask about the relation between Marx, Engels, and Wittgenstein, because I understand that they are authors that can be complemented, but it's not really clear for me. What are the coincidences? What are the match between Wittgenstein and Marx and Engels for the other place. Beyond the fact that they have been interested, Marx and Engels, in the fact that religion is involved in another kind of practice, and they make a deep investigation about a lot of aspects inherent to the needs of the people, and the religion question doesn't have any sense separated for another practices. So they, Marx and Engels, I mean, Wittgenstein says the religion is a practice, a language game, but may the accent in Marx and Engels is placed on that improvement and not on the inherent value of the religion. That inherent value is not very appreciated, I think. They do not see the religion like an especially practice who make the people better. His point is that the religion is an instrument, unlike a tool for the oppressor to dominate the oppressed. So if you can say something about the coincidence between Wittgenstein and the Marx and Engels view about the religion, because más allá de interesarse por la práctica concreta, me parece que su objetivo siempre es estudiar esa práctica concreta para ver cómo es un instrumento de dominio que debe superarse, ¿no? Y no como algo que deba permanecer porque enriquezca la vida de las personas. No sé si ha entendido esto último, por ahí Santiago lo traduce. Eso.
So I think you're right that there's a sort of contrast between them in terms of the way that they talk about practice, the sort of emphasis that they place on practice. So in Wittgenstein, the emphasis on practice is to sort of bring attention to the different kinds of claims and the different roles that they play in our lives, the way that our language is sort of embedded in practices. It's not so much on acting to bring about change in the world, right? So I think that's the emphasis in Marx and Engels. When Marxists say we've got an emphasis on practice, what they mean is we get out on the streets and do something about the things that we're arguing, rather than, well, I think there's the two sides in Marxism. I think also in Marxism there is the idea that you're supposed to sort of examine the sort of concrete situation, not be too sort of abstract in coming to conclusions. So I think there is this idea of paying attention to practices as well as a practical sort of overcoming of the circumstances that we find ourselves in. I think one thing that I don't think I mentioned in the talk that they do have in common is the sort of the emphasis on history and change, the sort of sensitivity to historical change, right? So in uncertainty, you get the talk about shifting bedrock. So there's this idea that if we understand religion in terms of hinges, that we're to be sort of sensitive to the way that might shift over time. So I think that's a way in which it's quite different from quite a lot of philosophers who think in a very abstract way and quite often sort of present what they're talking about as being sort of timeless. So you've got a sort of tradition from people like Plato. There was somebody else that I had in mind. Well, I mean, even somebody like Kant, the way he sort of thinks about morality, you know, I think in Wittgenstein and Marx, you've got a real focus on how things might change in all kinds of ways, and that's something that you have to be sensitive to if you're going to gain understanding. So concepts change and they shift with the circumstances. You're to pay attention to context that, so in his early work, there was quite a lot of attention just given to sort of propositions in the abstract. Whereas in his later work, there's a huge amount of emphasis on how sentences might change their meaning given or become senseless or play an entirely different role given changes in context. So something like this is a hand might take on a new significance if somebody's recovering from a bomb blast, from the situation in which they're just standing in a philosophy seminar, sticking their hand up in the air, or if they're searching through the rubble after a bomb blast and they're picking up rocks and they uncover something and they say this is a hand. That's quite a different case to the.
Perhaps in the same line of your argument, there's there is a good quote. Okay, I'll put it here. But it is the Wittgenstein says it is often said that a new religion brands the gods of the old one as devils, but in reality they have presumably by that time already become devils. Se me mezcla evils con devil. I mean, there is changes, and those changes make gods or demons, and that context might change. I think, no? O sea, que the historical, the social and the historical the ingredient is present in Wittgenstein. I don't know if completely, but I think that the religious propositions are very rare, very rare. It's common that they're mixed with superstition, with empirical. I think that there is no such I don't know, so pure. It's like an ideal type, I think, no? And that's what happens with I think, Rob, that happens when you talk about religion, you can't talk about religion or talk about social, political, etc. context. You have, everything is very mixed,
Yeah.
So it's not, they are not just arguing against Islam, they are arguing in favor of their own the culture and against the other culture.
Right.
Nothing is innocent, and because it's all mixed up. This is a religious proposition. Okay, is it so monolithic? No, I don't know. I'm sorry. Bueno, ya estamos.
I ask something. I don't know if it is a bit long for the response, but maybe you can say something short. You said earlier that you didn't think that Wittgenstein is a relativist, and I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate a bit more about that, because I think that in Uncertainty there are a lot of quotes that may seem like he is a relativist, no? Like when he says, I'm not an expert on Wittgenstein, but I remember some of these ideas about the hinges or this idea that beyond reason is persuasion, or this idea, it kind of seems sometimes like he is a relativist. So I wanted to know what makes you think that he's not.
Okay, so I think he's a relativist in a sort of very benign sort of way. He's a kind of conceptual relativist, right? So people might have different conceptual structures, or they might have different hinges, I think that's certainly true. There's Wittgenstein, I think, takes the view that there's no kind of neutral God's eye view where you can decide between the two, right? But I don't think that that leads to relativism, except in that sort of benign sense, in the sense that, you know, so people might have different color concepts. Some people might have a concept which includes red and green, we don't, and so we have different truths, and it might be that in the other language it's not possible to state truths that we can, but those truths remain truths, right? So I think that you can still be critical of them. It might just be that they're not able to engage with that, right? So it might be that you have to resort to persuasion. It might be that you have to resort to other means. It doesn't mean that everyone's right, though, presumably, right? That surely, so that couldn't be true. And I don't think Wittgenstein is committed to that, right? I don't think he wants to say that truth is relative. That couldn't be true, because it can't be both true that witches exist and that witches don't exist. And if both of those things mean the same, if you're using the concept in exactly the same way, there's a direct contradiction there. It can't be that both of them are true.
Yes, but there is not common ground, like you said, between, I don't know, incompatible language games. There is
right.
no. But I think that the question is if there really is, or there really are incompatible language games. No, there is always maybe some common ground. Maybe in that way there is the answer.
Right. Yeah. So that's one approach to it, is that, you know, it might be that some people don't have hinges in common, that there's some hinges that we don't have in common, but nonetheless there are some sort of basic hinges that everyone has.
Right. There has to be some
There's a
common
human
ground.
form of life that grounds things, so you can always sort of find your way into somebody's point of view. Yeah, that sounds right to me. Yeah, but on the other hand, I think it is also true that it really is the case that people do have different conceptual schemes. You know, that's an actuality. It's not just a sort of imagined case. I mean, Wittgenstein comes up with cases like the king who thinks that the world started with him, and so that would be a radically different kind of way of living in the world to ours. And in that case, you know, if everything that you say the king kind of builds into his world picture like somebody under a delusion, then you're not going to be able to sort of make your case a rational case with him, right? You're not going to be able to convince him by argument, perhaps. And so it might be that what you have to do is to resort to persuasion. But presumably, even with that king, you could find some common ground, and you could find some ways of kind of getting in there and convincing him by other means. But I mean, it's a fact that people have different moral systems. It's a fact that people have different color grammars, you know.
And culture and conflicts are not cultural or just conceptual, but for land, so you have we share things with the enemy. I don't know, ¿sí? Me parece. En ese sentido. I mean, in Marx's view. I don't know. Okay, let's Robert go. What time is it?
It's 5:23 here, so it's going to be what, 1:23 there.
Yeah, we are starving.
Okay, you have your lunch.
Okay.
Thank you very much again. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. It's very nice to talk to a group in Argentina again. It's
Okay. Thank you, Robert.
cheers.
Thank you. Bye.